Hello and welcome to another episode of the Operations Room, a podcast for COOs. I am Brandon Mensinga, alongside my co-host Bethany Ayers. How are you, Bethany?
I'm just tired. It's Christmas time almost. And I find this time of year really hard because there's so much we have to do work-wise and all of the planning and all of the next year stuff and closing all of the deals and go, and parties and silly season. But at the same time, the sun's going down at 3:30? Sunrise this morning was 8. The world is cocooning and sleeping. It's dark all the time, and yet we're trying to force our bodies to be the most active. Last week was so busy because we had our board meeting for provisional budget approval. So we've had to be doing the budgets. We have end of year reviews and pay rises to talk about. And you're still working on closing deals. And then also on top of that, because I'm on other boards, I had one board meeting and one meeting at 6:45 in the morning, the day after the Christmas party.
I'm sure you were on point in terms of your feedback to that company.
And that was talking about a fundraise. And so just like the only time they could fit in. And then we recorded this podcast after that, so I was just broken. So I've spent the entire weekend doing nothing. I have both boys back home. They've taken over our lives. We don't have a single glass in the house. I don't know where they go. They were home less than 24 hours and every single glass in the house had disappeared. It's a skill.
I'm not quite sure what kind of skill that is per se, but that is a skill.
It is a skill. And then also just having 4 people instead of 2 people in the house means the dishwasher is going all the time. I feel like all I'm ever doing is unloading the dishwasher. So no, not feeling particularly relaxed or ready for this. And then I absolutely love my in-laws. And I'm serious. I'm not somebody who doesn't like their in-laws, and they're coming for Christmas. But right now, the idea of preparing Christmas is wildly overwhelming. And so I spent the weekend trying to find places to maybe go out to eat, but nobody's keen. Nothing looks great. And also set menus for £95 a head.
That is standard these days, I think. If you want to set Christmas dinner, you're looking at least, £100 per person.
Which is crazy. And then I was looking at them and they didn't even include the sides for that price. I was like, what are you? I know you have to pay staff extra, but yeah. So, because that's £600 for 6 of us to go out. And although I really don't want to cook, that's maybe a bit toppy. Although it's great to just have that break, because every Christmas I do everything because gender. And so over the years, I've gotten more and more efficient. So I buy everything pre-made. So you just have to heat it, except still need to make the meat. And it still takes the whole day because of timings, and I have this list and I have to think about it. And our kitchen is separate to the rest of the house. And so everybody just sits in the other room having a great time. And I'm in the kitchen for the whole day.
Bethany, where's my eggnog? What's happening?
Yeah. It's because I'm the only one who actually cares about Christmas. This year, I was saying to my husband that he's going to have to help because although I'm the only one that cares about Christmas, everybody else still benefits from Christmas. And I don't want to just be there all by myself. And I'm exhausted and I can't quite imagine it right now. So yeah, so Christmas, time for relaxation.
So on that note, why don't we flip on over to what is a wonderful topic today. We have what is a COO Strengths and Gaps. And we have an amazing guest for this, which is Divinia Knowles. She is the founder of the COO Roundtable, which we are a part as well, and the former COO of Mind Candy. And more broadly, Divinia is really the COO Coach of note, I would say, in London as it stands right now. So before we get to Divinia, I wanted to talk about the strengths side of things. So I'll go through the strengths one by one, and I'll just kind of quote them as the way that she described it, maybe just get your view on how do you learn that particular thing or get better at it. And the first one that she talked about was being highly adaptable and flexible in approach, listening to the opinions of others and seeking to understand with empathy. So if you want to get better at being adaptable and flexible in your approach, what are some things that we could throw out there to folks to think about?
Well, it's funny because part of when Divinia was going through the strengths and the weaknesses, or the strengths and the gaps, I would say, is that a lot of the strengths seem to be attributes, whereas the gaps were gaps in knowledge. So I didn't think we were comparing apples and oranges. And so some of that is just an attribute. To some extent, you're born with the ability or not, but then you can get better at it. Like, I was not a particularly patient person, and I've definitely learned to listen more as I've gotten older. And that has been a combination of noticing I wasn't patient and exploring why I'm not patient and what does that mean about me and what are my insecurities that are feeding it. So that's part of like therapy and doing the work and introspection. And then the other part is just practice. So just listening and see what happens when you're not trying to jump in with your ideas, and have faith that your idea will come up, when there's time, but otherwise just hold on to what the other person is saying. And the number of times where somebody has an idea and I'm like, ooh, yes, that's a really good idea for all these different reasons. And in my head, I just go, and we'll wait. And they might talk longer than I want, and they might be a bit rambly, but they 9 times out of 10 get to all of the different reasons why it's a good idea and the interconnects that I also had. And it's just like, okay, look, I can have faith that other people can figure out these interconnects too. And that they might not realize why their idea is a good idea, and they have to think it through out loud, but they get to all of those points. And so it just becomes an ability to let go and trust other people more, because over time it's proven over and over again. So it's kind of like practice, see that it works, reinforces it, continue to practice.
So the second one she'd spoken about was high resilience threshold, working through barriers arising and committing wholeheartedly. So what do you make of this in terms of getting better at that?
I was just laughing at my preamble, which I think is all about high resilience.
It really is. Yeah.
Digging deep or being resilient, ignoring your own needs. Yeah, maybe not the healthiest way of viewing that one. I think resilience really is one of those that you have a certain amount that you're born with, and then you can reinforce. Like, some people are just not as resilient as others. And maybe sometimes it's not just resilience, but also like questioning ambition and what you want in life, because it's fine to choose different levels of grit and hard work. So I have been born and blessed and cursed with a massive Puritan work ethic. I work hard. I do my A star. I am not lazy. But the resilience for me comes from not just working hard because you'll break yourself, but taking time to reflect after something shitty has happened and seeing that I survived it. So the next time something shitty happens, I know I'll be able to survive it again. And I guess it's like, I just really like empirical evidence. So I take the time to review my empirical evidence, and I have empirical evidence that I'm resilient and therefore believe I can do it again.
I've had this conversation many times in the past where at the end of the day, there's been some massive issue within the company. A single person or several people have freaked out about whatever is going on. And, sitting down with them to talk them through what has happened. And the fact of the matter is, we live to fight another day. And regardless of what's happened, things are going to move on. So as long as we kind of anchor ourselves to what we're trying to accomplish for the purpose of why we're here and why we're at this company and why we're bothering to wake up in the morning, and we'll get past this. I think that kind of mentality and mindset and kind of sharing that with individuals, I think usually tends to help.
So you're actually building resilience within your team rather than talking about how to build resilience within yourself.
I guess kind of both in a way, because I tell myself the same thing. I think as you get older and more mature, I think these machinations of company tend to impact you less, and you care less about them in a sense. Like, you care a lot about your career and your focus and delivering good results, but it's like holding everything quite lightly, I guess, in terms of how it actually impacts you. And I feel like only through experience and time have I gotten to a place where the minutiae of what happens in these companies does not impact me or affect me, unless it's, crazy dramatic, I suppose. Take it for what it is. It's a software company. Nobody's going to die. We're going to move on. I'm going to have a great career regardless of whether this company succeeds or not. But I'm here. And because I'm here, I want to make this work, and I want to do my best job to make that happen, I guess. So I think it's a bit of like that thinking that I'm trying to like plant in myself and also plant in others, where we're here 8 hours a day, working our asses off. Let's make an impact.
Perspective is always very good. I think just because of the year that I've had, as everybody knows, my resilience wasn't actually necessarily work related. Like, there's just been a lot of deaths this year to get over, and a lot of health issues, where there's still a level of resilience and understanding that life can throw a lot at you or a lot at me, and I can survive it.
All right. Number 3, gap filling. So overseeing and managing areas where there may be functional leaders missing and filling those gaps for whatever time period. How do you get good at that?
I don't know how you get good at it. I don't know if you should get good at it, but it just seems to be, again, something that happens a lot. Like that has been the number one story of my career. At New Voice Media, I was SVP of strategy, but I basically did all of the bits of other people's jobs they didn't know how to do. I was like the unsung hero of all of those things, or as our very scary French chair called it, I was Miss Shitlist.
Right. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, it was like so inspiring. And then even now at Peak, we have our head of account management going on maternity leave. And guess who's now the acting mat leave cover?
Oh, nice. Right.
On top of everything else.
Nice. Yeah.
What was the most random function you've ever led for a while?
The marketing one does spring to mind because marketing is probably where I'm least knowledgeable, but have the biggest opinion. So it's a bad cocktail.
It's like a nightmare for the marketing team.
Exactly. But in fairness to myself, like I try to hold all that stuff in check and do my best job to be a proper CEO, which is listen to what's happening, listen to the experts that are on the ground, listen to experts that I know outside the company that are good marketers, and try to ask really smart, useful questions to make sure that we're thinking about the right things, whether I'm the expert or not, in that case, doesn't matter. But as long as I'm kind of holding people to account, asking good questions, driving the program forward, let the experts kind of do their thing, then generally speaking, you're in a decent position. So what's your most random backfill?
For me, it was FP&A, so financial planning and analysis, because I didn't know it was a thing. I didn't know it was a discipline. I just was self-taught into figuring out how to build models. And for like 3.5 years at Peak, I was the FP&A function. So basically, our CFO said, looking at the future is what strategy does. You're looking at the future. In order to look at it, you need to model it. Go. And I did, because I was young and inexperienced and didn't realize. And so I did it for 3.5 years. And then we got bigger, and then we raised money from TCV. And then we had like more sophisticated people come in and a new CFO who hired somebody whose entire job was FP&A. And I was like, oh, this is a discipline. This is a job. Like, this is one person's job. This isn't just 1/5 of my job. It was such an eye opener for me. And it was like, we raised 120 million off the back of my models.
Really? Wow. Okay. That's impressive.
I had no idea what I was doing. With enough logic, it was fine. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. Especially like fundraising that amount of money based off a model with a non-professional at the helm of it.
So for Bessemer and TCV, both.
Actually, this is a question for you. When do you need proper modeling, do you think, in 2024?
Oh, I mean, way, way before we had it. Yeah. I think with your Series A, given the size of Series A's nowadays, you definitely need a finance professional. You need it for the model in the future, and you need it for not ridiculously spending your money on stupid things. Like, it's just a good bit of experience. I think part of the reason why we could get away with me doing whatever I was doing was because we had a very experienced team, except for me. I was the least experienced by far. And so, although I was the glue that held things together and did everybody's shit jobs, they also gave me context and experience that I didn't know about. And you also need experience. And you need to find it somehow. You need a combination of people who don't have experience with people who do. And what I see a lot is companies that get to their Series A where just everybody is new to the world. And now once you have a sizable amount of money in your bank account, you start to need to have some people who are not new to the world.
Typically, when you come into a Series A, a lot of teams are pure newbies to the world, as you described it. How many kind of like more senior executives do you think you need on the pathway from A to B? So if you had to mix that team a little bit in terms of seniority.
So I definitely go for some sort of finance person. I hate the term, but I don't know how else to say it, a finance person with an operations spike. So you can get some amount of like, what's a leadership team do? Who should be in a leadership team? The importance of meeting regularly, the importance of having clear reporting plus a good model plus fiscal responsibility. And then I would put somebody in the technical area as well, because quite often technical co-founders are great at hacking stuff together, but don't actually know how to scale an organization, as you tend to need somebody who knows how to scale on the product side. And those would be the minimal viable hires I would make.
So why don't we park it here and get on to our conversation with Divinia Knowles. We are revving up the engine of the podcast and looking for a great brand to sponsor the show. We have over 7,000 listeners now across COOs, CEOs, founders, and operational professionals who are decision makers for all kinds of technology, including HR, planning, strategy, legal, and other tools.
It's Beth here. I just wanted to thank you for listening to the podcast, and we'd love to keep it going, but we're going to need to get some sponsors in order to do that. So if you work at a company that could benefit from speaking to listeners like you, or know of a company that might benefit, please send them our way.
To find out more, go to operationsroom.co/sponsorship. That is operationsroom.co/sponsorship. So what are the strengths of CEOs en masse? What does that look like for us?
So the ones that indexed most highly, and you won't be surprised by some of these, definitely, because I wasn't, building strong relationships with key decision makers in the business. And that means anywhere, right? So board, peer, below, and rest of team. And I feel like that's a real strength of COOs generally. Like they're generally very humble, servant leadership, able to really connect and take people on the journey. Then you've got owning and managing their functional areas that lend well to their strengths. They're very resilient, as you would imagine, from all the things that they then have to do and go through. And when they work through barriers, they tend to be quite consensus-driven in their approach with others, and then will commit wholeheartedly to what is decided. They're highly adaptable and flexible. They love corralling other people's opinions, understanding what other people think of situations, and they embrace perspectives even when they're not their own. So they can be that person who really helps to homogenize and curate opinions and understand what different people are thinking. Gap filling, no surprise there. So leading other functional areas when there's a leader missing. We get drafted into that a lot. And then changing processes if they're not effective, but doing it in a very systematic, pragmatic way. And I often hear this spoken about as treating it like a product. So internal stakeholders are your customer. So that thinking about it that way. Those are the biggest strengths. I mean, there are lots, right? And this is a certain segment of a population. But it is the segment of the population, it was very mixed in terms of gender. So 50-50 gender. And actually, in terms of the COOs that we got responses back from, these are not incredibly early stage COOs. These are actually people who are quite experienced in their role. So this is why I thought this was super interesting, because some of the gaps then are interesting given that that's the context. They're not newbie COOs who are early stage of their career. These are folks who've been doing it for a little while.
Given that we're talking about fairly senior or senior COOs, I don't know, how dare we have gaps because we're perfectionists, so we're A-star kind of kids. What are those gaps that you find in the COOs?
The first one, and again, there are some of these where you're like, yes, generally speaking, this would seem to be a gap, but being an external spokesperson for the business, and whether that's attending networking events, speaking at conferences. And I actually love this one because this one is incredibly nuanced, I think, around the fact that actually some COOs are incredibly comfortable being an internal spokesperson. That's why external is interesting. And even those COOs who are incredibly comfortable being an internal spokesperson sometimes struggle speaking at board level, which again is the tipping point possibly between internal and external, maybe.
I'm wondering if it's struggling to speak at the board or this dynamic around disagree and commit and then showing a united front in front of the board. This is something I definitely found difficult myself the last time round, because I wouldn't necessarily always agree with the decisions that had been made that we were then representing to the board. And then if I was asked specifically my opinion, I would find it difficult because I didn't want to show not a united front. And it's like, where is your loyalty? Is your loyalty with the board, or is your loyalty with the exec team / the CEO? And so I don't know if it's a discomfort so much as a hard place to be, and having to decide when you state your ground and when you disagree and commit.
I also found it quite difficult sometimes in board situations, this is when I was operating, to know what my role was. I know it sounds a bit weird, but it's like if the CEO is updating on all of these different things and he's the sort of being the face of the company, it almost has to be pre-contracted that you have a role at the board. Otherwise, you end up sort of sitting there.
I think CEOs generally perceive themselves as very internal facing people. So they see themselves as that, they do the all hands, they do strategic offsites, and they may be wonderful speakers, but they don't see themselves as the external person for the company. They're not in sales. They're not the CEO of the company. They don't feel like it's part of their remit, I think. So part of it, I think, is partially a mindset shift to understand that the external side is equally as important. And I think that customer centricity, really understanding some of the issues that they're having, in a much more at a senior level, because you can bring that external relationship, that external kind of understanding back into the company and have much more of that real connection to the marketplace. And I think that's not a sales role, and it doesn't have to be a CEO role. It can be a COO role.
By the way, there's another gap in there, which is interesting, which we should come on to talk about. But I was having a fascinating conversation with Andrew Richardson recently, and we were talking about the same thing. Lots of COOs, the external spokesperson thing can also go to customer, right? Lots of COOs can have limited interaction with customers, and therefore you then have less of a connection to what customers' problems are and so on. And you don't see yourself as a salesperson as such. And I think that could be quite problematic, actually, as a COO, because you get a whole different view, as you say, on the business by talking to customers and seeing it from their viewpoint.
But I think there's two elements to external. There's the external spokesperson versus having customer relationships. And that spokesperson, I can again see why the COO might not always feel comfortable doing that, particularly if you have a co-founder CEO or founder CEO, where it's their vision, their baby. They're the ones who are thinking 5 years ahead and evangelizing all the time. You're never going to sound as good. You're never going to be that founder who just loves it and thinks about it 24 hours a day. And so it's around figuring out what kind of spokesperson you can be, where you are authentic and understand the business, but are not going to necessarily be emulating or carbon copy of a founder CEO who's just in a different level.
Absolutely. And finding the things that you're passionate about talking about for you then will make the whole external spokesperson piece a lot easier. But I agree with you. It's very difficult. It's a bit role-based again. What's your role in doing it? Why? What's the outcome? What's the desired outcome of you doing it? Because whilst it can be to raise your own brand, there sort of has to be a business-oriented reason also to do it. And when I was at Mind Candy, mine was a lot talent related, as in encouraging folks to understand that it was a great place to be and all of that kind of good stuff, bringing people to us, which I felt like was a great role, actually, as an external spokesperson, because I loved being there so much that I could really evangelize that. And it was a slightly different perspective to the founder CEO who was talking, as you say, about why we were doing what we're doing, how it was going to go, the vision, the mission, all of that kind of good stuff. But it's a great one. And Brandon, you mentioned another gap.
So Brandon knows all the gaps.
I know. I'm on the gaps. I'm all over the gaps right now.
But yeah, so that one was a great one. Would you like to move to another gap?
Well, I want to know the gaps that Brandon's mentioned. What are these ones that Brandon's getting?
So there's one around sort of being a negotiator, which is also related to the customer side of things, which came out as a gap. And again, understandably, because whilst you have a group of COOs, you may have a spike in customer operations or go-to-market, sales, etc. You also have a load that don't, right? They have a very different skew.
I would think because so many COOs come with a CFO background, CFOs are good at negotiating as well and really on the money. Maybe it's the COOs that come from a pure ops background that struggle with it, because those of us from sales are used to negotiating and those of us from CFO worlds are as well, or at least should be. Like a good CFO really needs to know how to negotiate.
True. I think it's, as you say, it's pure ops, because if you've come from a sales background, you'll have it already. CFO is an interesting one because I found that not all CFOs have that.
Maybe that would be a gap for other CFOs. I mean, because how else are you going to get really good? Well, first of all, to stand your ground and make sure that the deals that you're doing and that your sales team are doing are good deals. So you need to understand and actually be in deals or have a team that are in deals. And then also when you're buying major contracts, having the CFO in as that final bad cop to lower the price is just essential.
I used to have a great guy that worked for me, a guy called Alex, who was a very, very commercial finance person. And he would go and renegotiate things like payment terms and stuff, which from a financial perspective is incredibly important. It's slightly tangential, but like you tend to have some who are more commercial and some who are more technical, and they tend into two camps, right?
Just another little piece of opinion of mine is for startups and scale ups, you need commercial finance people and not technical finance people.
Yeah, because your actual technical is going to be quite low. Probably it's going to be quite straightforward versus the commercial side of things, which might be a lot more helpful.
And there's just no value add if you get somebody who's just straight technical, because you need someone who can negotiate with fundraising, understand the best ways of structuring those types of deals, somebody who can work with your customers and structure your deals well there, and your suppliers. So anyhow, if anybody happens to be listening who's hiring a CFO or a finance person, those are my 2 cents.
And I would also say for the COO, I feel like I'm constantly negotiating in different forms. And usually it's more complex situations where the commission plan for the sales reps is broken for some reason. And the sales rep, the leader of the sales team, has been caught out. They need to talk to somebody about it in terms of what to do because person A is really upset for whatever reason. And that VP of sales needs to have a conversation around what we need to negotiate with that person, or other non-standard situations where a leadership team member has also either contractual issues or something that's happening in terms of they're winding down and the terms associated to that wind down and how to get the best out of that person. There's some level of negotiation that needs to occur. So I feel like for the CEO, there's often this non-standard negotiation spectrum of things that pop up all over the place where, it may not be strictly like a supplier negotiation, but there's definitely a lot of non-standard negotiations that need to happen where you're involved to come up with the best outcome for an individual or for a team.
It's interesting because I think COOs have the skills for negotiation, but when you put the label of negotiation on it, we get a bit freaked out because we're like, ooh, that's salesy, that's external, that is an area and a remit I'm not used to. Whereas if you think about the strengths that you mentioned, one of the first strengths was doing great stakeholder management, which is just negotiation.
Well, and even company comms, right? A lot of company comms is actually objection handling, really. And so there's lots of kind of pieces of it that actually fit in the internal piece. But maybe it's the external that gets a bit like, this is sort of not known to me. It's a bit more uncomfortable. So it's an interesting one. The other gap that Brandon mentioned was resource allocation. And this came up quite strongly. And having then spoken to the COOs about this one, I now realize why. Because on the face of it, you're like, they should be really good at that. And again, sort of my experience married with theirs was, well, in these companies, you're constantly having to rejig resource allocation. It doesn't just stay the same. If you're scaling, you're like, okay, where do we need people? Or if you've got different parts of the business that are running, some bits will be working, some bits won't be working. So you might need to right-size certain bits of it at different times or change the structure in different places. And I think they get this sense that they therefore are always sort of second-guessing themselves. At Mindcandy, I did do it at Pact actually a little bit, but quarterly right-sizing was how I used to think about it, where every quarter I would then kind of look at the org again and think, right, are we good at the moment? Or have we got some weird bits that are happening in different places? Have we got the right structures? Have we got the right people? Have we got the right sort of levels? All of this sort of stuff because of this thing. But I think it is a challenge, and it's knowing when you've got the right balance as well, especially if you think about where you're investing versus where you're not, if you're trying to be profitable, what that means, So I think it's quite a tricky area, an area of ambiguity. And they might be good at it, but not think they're good at it. That's the other thing, because it's really hard.
And it's changing. Like it's a problem that never ends. And so if you have to change, doesn't mean that you got it wrong. It just means that the company has changed.
Yeah. And it kind of feels like there's two aspects to it. Like what is the purely financial side with the financial modeling? Because you're trying to model out the future of the company over the next, 3, 6, 9, 12 months and what that looks like. And you're constantly iterating it based on actual revenue and actual budget and these sorts of things. And you're thinking through how best to allocate funds for the future in terms of hires or what have you. So there's purely that side of it. That there's an entirely different dynamic around the actual people in the company, the skills that you have, the capabilities that you have or don't have, And that's much more really understanding, I guess, their existing employee base in terms of what they're good at and what they're capable of doing in the future type of thing. But being able to combine those two things together and do it on this iterative basis with the functional leaders, I think that's where it all comes together, where the CEO hopefully is connecting all those dots to try to think that through holistically for the company, working with whatever functional leader that they're working with.
And then I think the newest element to throw into that, which might also make, at least I'm struggling with at the moment, is where does Gen AI fit in? And therefore, where your allocation of resource, of finding new skills, investing in technology, and what can and cannot actually be done more efficiently with Gen AI. And it's like a new resource to try and allocate.
Well, I even found that I'm a fractional COO at a very small business now. We still have the same challenge. It's just on a much smaller scale. It's like we'll change things and do things. And then like about a month later, we'll be like, is that the right thing to do? Or have we really sort of set ourselves up for success here, and then think about it again? So much so that as soon as I heard this from the COOs in the survey, I was like, yeah, this one's just because it just keeps moving. You can't ever say you've done it.
And then would you recommend on some cadence or basis thinking through it quite specifically? Because generally speaking, as a CEO, I think about it when I need to think about it, as opposed to setting some kind of time slot or something like that. But what do you make of that?
I would if the company is scaling, definitely. And that's what the situation I found myself in, which was like, I feel like I am the only person potentially who is thinking about this in the holistic round in the same way. And the CEO is off making deals and doing other things and developing the company in different ways. So I was like, right, this has to be me. So I am going to think about, I'm going to just deliberately time box it, just keep thinking about it in different pieces. So, I mean, it worked for me, put it that way. That worked well in the situation that I was in.
I think quarterly works because that's when you're rebudgeting or you're trying to decide what's the hiring plan for the next quarter. So it's an opportunity to pause and make sure that the plan from the last quarter is still necessary.
Even in scaling territory, it feels like you hold your nerve for a bit just to make sure everybody beds in. And then so it kind of is a stepped growth path versus you can't just keep adding more and more and more and more people and expecting that it's going to be efficient. So that also works well in a quarterly cadence. Yeah, it's an interesting one, that one. So this is something that we're trying to do something about at the moment, but it's got two bits to it. Understanding financial reports was one side of it. And the other side of it, and there's nuance to this, we'll talk about it.
Okay, of course, there's always nuance.
Understanding business metrics in businesses that you don't work in, which different business models, like the metrics that drive success in different business models. What should we talk about first? Metrics or financials?
Let's go financials.
Okay, so the financials one. The financials one is interesting, right? So I believe that, again, from talking to the folks at the event and afterwards, it's not that they don't understand financials per se. As in, and I had this with a wonderful lady who's a client of mine who in her own head was like, this isn't a strength of mine. Actually, then we went through a set of financials and the observations she made about it were brilliant. She's very astute. It's all good. However, if you then went one layer deeper than that and you asked her or them off the back of a balance sheet or something like that, more complex questions around financial management, no, it wouldn't happen. And so I think that's where this comes in. It's like to a point where you could make strategic business-based decisions off the back of reading your balance sheet, for example. That's where this, I think, falls down versus being able to read financial data. And if you think in certain board scenarios where you've more often than not, you've got more financially literate folks, possibly less operationally literate at times, then they're likely to have really in-depth knowledge of company valuation and how you do it and what you're looking for, or funding mechanisms, or any of these things that COO might not. They may not have as much of a view or opinion on that, dependent on their knowledge or what they've been exposed to.
I feel like in terms of the financial instruments, there's always a new one. There's always, like, currently every person I speak to, I guess because of the avoidance of down rounds, are talking about CLNs, convertible loan notes. And like 5 years ago, nobody talked about a CLN. And now, like, every single time I go to a meeting, I talk to somebody, they're like, oh, we're negotiating a CLN. And we all just know about it now. Every time I go to drinks, somebody is negotiating one and wants to know about something. But anyhow, like, I do agree. You learn it as you need it. And we're not CFOs unless we were CFOs to begin with, which is, for me, it's not necessarily a skill that I would go out and desperately try and improve versus just having a good CFO or the ability to Google things. I think it's important to know what your strengths are and where you need to know enough and to learn what you need to learn when you need to know it, rather than like go out and just decide to learn it for no particular reason when you're in a business that's not going to be funding.
The challenge here, I think, is that there's a level of proficiency that's expected. And so how do you get to that without then massively overdoing it? I even think, if I look back, I was a hybrid COO CFO because I qualified in my evenings to become a chartered accountant, because I'd sit in the board meetings sometimes and I'd be like, I don't know what they're talking about. It's something financial. I'm not really sure what they're saying.
I would say this, though. I kind of feel like, to Bethany's point, I feel like I've picked up finance where I've needed to understand it to help run the business, basically. So when I think about my financial acumen, a lot of it revolves around financial forecasts, not the P&L. So I've essentially, to help run the business effectively and think through how we spend money and what the revenue creation is going to look like, and making sure that burn rate's appropriate. Anything that revolves around that, I'm very interested in. And to your point, Bethany, I've Googled, ad nauseum. I've looked at all sorts of videos and stuff like that. At this point in my life and career, I can very much pair with a finance person where collectively we can work together, where they're excellent at modeling. I'm excellent at understanding the business and what happens in the business itself. And you combine those two things together, then boom, you have like models that actually really represent the business, and you can actually do some proper modeling to figure out how to spend money and how to ensure that you're ramping in a sensible way.
And then if you talk about the board level conversations, because those are different to the modeling that Brandon's talked about, it's much more fundraising strategy, corporate debt, different types of instruments where like balance sheet matters, and what are you capitalizing and what are you, kind of like the art of working on your financials so that you look the right way depending on what your valuation, like, is it a revenue-based valuation? Is it an EBITDA-based valuation? How do you make it look the way it needs to, or as close to it as you can? But I guess for me, all of that's come through experience, through conversations, and I've very much been a just-in-time learner. And also on the boards that I sit on, my pitch is I'm the operator. I'm like the friend of the CEO. I can understand what's hard in your life, but I've also done so many fundraising rounds. I've hung out with investors. I understand how they think. I know what an investment banker does, that I can help translate on both sides. And what I'm not going to do is help with your fundraising strategy. And conversely, your board members who have always been investment bankers should not be trying to help you on your go-to-market strategy. And like, if we understand our lanes and we can talk a little bit across them and know enough that if something sounds really wonky, we can intercept. But I think it's very valuable in board conversations for people to understand where your level of expertise is and why you're sitting at the table. And I'm not going to try and pretend that I'm a financial expert and I'm going to understand the investment strategy in the way that these guys who do it all day long, and for the most part are guys, what they negotiate, how they think about it, all the ins and outs. It's fascinating to learn.
No, I'm with you. And I think to tie your points together 100%, and I think this is a level of proficiency that even a level of proficiency that gives you the confidence to be in the room when it's being spoken about. I totally agree on the forward facing piece. And I think that's why the balance sheet side of it is interesting, because that's more of the forward facing, what will we be doing with the business? How do we leverage our assets? All of that sort of thing. And that's the bit that they're probably missing. Should we talk about the business metrics side?
I'm curious on that one. Yeah.
So one woman's opinion, I just may as well just decloak myself. So one woman's opinion, since I sort of understood some different business models, I feel like I then got more of an appreciation for the business models I worked in. Whereas I worked in subscription business models for a really long time, right? So I know subscription business models like the back of my hand. You could ask me anything, pretty much, maybe. And I'd have a view, whether it's right or wrong, I'd have a view. And then I started learning about other ones and was like, hey, that's interesting, because if I'd have known that, you could apply some of that to that. And actually just knowing one thing is all very well, but you then are in a complete vacuum. And it was only after then, it's not like I've then seen all the different business models out there, but just enough that I could then sort of have a bit of objective perspective. And yet you tend to find that actually, because people stay in certain industries, they may, like me, just be a one. They may have one that's they know inside and out, and then you throw something else at them and they have no idea how it works. So it's the informing of like one business model against another, and actually sort of the importance of different metrics in different places, and even what you can beg, borrow and steal.
It's interesting because like I have this emotional reaction of like, I'm in my space, I have my metrics, nothing else matters. And because I haven't looked, I don't know. But I think it would be interesting. I think it's a fair challenge. And again, for me, it goes back to Gen AI has captured my imagination. What are any of our worlds going to look like in 5 years, let alone 10 years time? What are our new business models going to be? So I can get the idea of going out and learning different ones now, just to realize that there are as many options as there are, to help open my mind to what the future might be, rather than beg, borrow and steal for what today looks like. Because I really am trying to see, how are all of our businesses, what are our lives going to be like in 5 years?
Yeah. And I would almost double down on what you said, Divinia, because I kind of feel like the more you understand other types of businesses and how they operate from a business model point of view and their pricing and packaging and that sort of thing, it just helps inform how you think about your business and your context as to what's happening. Because oftentimes things will come up or things will change, right? So suddenly we're going from enterprise selling into product-led growth. And you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? So product-led growth, I found I was stealing bits from my past to think through the PLG side of things and product-led sales and so on.
It's an interesting one. And even if I think about Mind Candy, so Mind Candy was its core subscription, but we then went into licensing and licensing royalty, we went into music royalties. Every time we went into a new piece, no idea. I was like, ooh, that sounds interesting. I have to go and figure out how that works then. But then the more I got into it, the more I was like, gosh, this is really fascinating, because depending on the assets that you create, the value you create, you can monetize it in many different ways. Like you may get so fixed in one space that you can't actually see that there's opportunity, if you know what I mean. There are a multitude of ways to create even more value for the business from this thing, this piece of value asset we've created. And yet it depends if I can see it or not, if it's even in my peripheral vision, you know? And it does come back to, there's another gap on here, by the way, that's around future-facing projects and opportunities for businesses. And again, I wonder if this is because normally it's seen as the purview of the CEO, where it's like, no, the sort of the development of the business is down to you. But actually, I think it's one of the most interesting bits. So I always loved being part of that as a COO. And so developing knowledge in that area, but interesting that it's a gap, quite a big gap as well.
The gap is future.
So defining future-based opportunities for business, whether it be, I think, sweating current assets in a different way, or M&A, corporate development, ways to grow a business that may be slightly outside of your kind of experience set.
Some of these gaps, I think, are just like a lack of opportunity rather than something that you need to go out immediately. Like, I guess I'm just thinking it's a just-in-time learning, and you'll figure it out when you need to.
I think there's like a step down situation where you have the same product repackaged, repurposed for a different marketplace. Somebody needs to figure out how to sell it into that new space, not sell it into new space, but really structure a program to go into that new space, whereby you're pulling the assets of the company in a different direction, and how you operationally pull that together, programmatically set it in motion, and get the resources behind it to make it happen without distracting the company in a way that is not helpful. Basically, there's definitely an art and a science to that. And I think the operator having space and capacity to be able to focus on things like that is, I think, is really important.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting. And it always brings me back to this. And again, sort of tangible example, when I was at Mind Candy, we created a secondary product for children, which was a creative space that they could be creative in, and sort of a community social network type of thing. And because we then got to a point where we didn't feel like we were the right people to run it, it got divested. We sold it to Super Awesome. It was clever because we sold it to them, but with a kickback that then meant that we then could keep cash coming in from it as they monetized it and put it through all their advertising channels and really sort of boosted its revenue. So the more they then did that, the more money we then got back over a period of time, which helped the business to sort of stabilize itself over time. I wouldn't have thought that, not at the time. Like, it was clever. I was like, well, and of course Michael is very clever, but I was a bit like, that's really good. Like, that's just such a good thing to do. There's something about skill set around spotting opportunities. I don't have it, by the way. That's not my natural mode of operation at all. If we think about sort of COOs being a true partner to the CEO founder, and this is where I got involved in this, because I used to then love having conversations with them about it, where I was like, God, I don't know anything about this. It's really interesting. And stuff that they would then tell me, and I'd be like, I wouldn't even have noticed that. That wouldn't have come into my brain. Different way of thinking. So I wonder if it's that sage or trusted advisor, CEO, COO partnership thing, that having a bit of kind of that way of thinking is sometimes helpful.
I think it's also entrepreneurs are just rule breakers, or not even, they are rule not seers. I don't even know if they're breaking rules. It's just like,
yeah, there are no boundaries.
Nothing. And COOs are quite often rule creators, enforcers, and followers. And therefore, our brains are not always necessarily going for like infinite possibilities, whereas entrepreneurs tend to. And everything has a plus and a dark side and a light side. And so the light side is what you're talking about with the lovely kickback. And then the dark side are just deals that are horrible and you never actually see any money from, or possibly illegal, It's like, yeah.
It's always true, isn't it? But I do think this. I think the relationship in that way is where the CEO can really be helpful to the CEO, which is sometimes, as we know, CEOs can have all sorts of crazy ideas about all sorts of things and drag the company in different directions that are super unhelpful and very destructive in a lot of ways. So the question of having a sensible CEO sitting there to talk that stuff through, but also for the CEO to have some level of like outlaw element to them, where they're not going to simply dismiss what the CEO is saying outright, but actually having that open-minded space to think it through with them, to bounce it back and forth a little bit, and to help the two of you come to a mutual conclusion.
Well, and it's the worst thing you can say to a CEO founder, right? Is no. Versus, yeah, that's a great idea. I'm not sure we can do it now, but let's put it on the backlog or something, or let's discuss it and actually see if we could. But the worst thing is a no, right? Then you're a blocker and a barrier and all of those things.
It's the old adage from improv. It's always the yes and response.
For our listeners, if they could only remember one thing from our conversation today, what would it be?
I think this piece around strengths-based management is actually really important. I mentioned to you, I've all the way up to the session, I've been thinking about this, where I was like, I love this because I now know how I can support my COOs further. However, how do you build on your strengths and really lean into those and get proficient enough in the areas that are your gaps or that are your perceived gaps in order that you feel confident in your role? Because I think that's the important piece about it. It's actually about, as you were saying, it's like just-in-time learning. Just-in-time learning is absolutely fine, right? That's a good way of going about things. And how can you know enough that you just feel confident in those rooms and spaces where you need to hold a good conversation? So I think that's the takeaway.
Lovely. So thank you for coming back onto the operations room, Divinia. If you like what you hear, please leave a comment or subscribe, and we will see you next week.